She had once believed that marriage was meant to be a sacred bond, something built on trust, love, and the promise of forever. When she married her husband, she had carried dreams in her heart and innocence in her eyes, believing that their union would lead to a future filled with warmth and laughter. She had given herself wholly, pouring her energy into keeping their home alive, tending to his needs, and sacrificing her own desires just to see him content. Every step she took was weighed with thoughtfulness, every meal prepared with care, and every smile forced with the hope that one day he would truly notice her devotion. For her, marriage was a duty and a gift, and she embraced it even as cracks began to appear. The cracks, however, were not hidden for long. Behind closed doors, her husband was not the gentle partner she longed for but a man consumed by selfish desires. He cared little for her sacrifices, rarely acknowledging the sleepless nights she spent waiting for him or the quiet tears she shed when he dismissed her attempts at closeness. His heart, she would later realize, had never belonged to her fully. It was trapped elsewhere, tangled in the web of another woman who whispered poison into his ears and fed his arrogance. Her love was met with coldness, her loyalty repaid with betrayal. He would leave home without explanation, returning at ungodly hours, the scent of another woman's perfume clinging to his clothes. When she confronted him gently, hoping for honesty, he brushed her off with cruel words, reminding her that she was lucky he had chosen her at all. To him, her sacrifices were invisible, her love a burden, and her presence an inconvenience he tolerated only out of obligation. Yet she stayed. Out of loyalty, out of fear, and out of a desperate hope that someday the man she had fallen for would return to her. She bore the weight of loneliness in silence, carrying her pain quietly like a shadow that never left her side. Her friends saw her smile and believed she was content, but behind that mask, her heart was breaking. As her pregnancy grew, she clung to the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, the child would soften his heart, but deep down she knew the truth, that her marriage was not a union of love, but a prison built on lies. The mistress was the kind of woman who thrived on other people's misery, her beauty a mask that hid a heart consumed by greed and envy. She entered the husband's life not by accident, but by design, weaving her way into his world with calculated charm and a sly smile that promised excitement his marriage supposedly lacked. To him, she appeared as a vision of freedom, glamorous, bold, and unapologetic. But beneath the glitter of her exterior lay a manipulative core, one that fed on destruction and desired nothing less than the complete erasure of his wife from his life. Every meeting between them became a breeding ground for venom. She whispered lies into his ears, carefully crafted to fan the flames of discontent in his marriage. "She's weak," she would sneer, rolling her eyes whenever the topic of his pregnant wife arose. "She only holds you back. With me, you could have so much more. Power, wealth, excitement. She's nothing compared to what I could give you." Her words slithered into his mind, poisoning what little affection might have remained for his wife. She painted the wife not as a partner but as an obstacle, someone unworthy of his love or loyalty. Her greed was boundless. She dreamed of taking the wife's place, of living in the home that the wife had built with love, of claiming the title and respect that came with being his lawful partner. The wife's pregnancy, instead of softening the mistress's disdain, fueled it further. Jealousy burned in her veins at the thought of the unborn child, a living bond that tied husband and wife together in ways she could never replicate. That envy twisted her into something even more ruthless, pushing her to demand gestures of loyalty that bordered on cruelty. It wasn't enough for her to simply win his attention. She wanted to see his wife humiliated, broken, and discarded. She mocked the wife openly, laughing at her swollen body and fragile condition, comparing her to a burden dragging him down. In her presence, the husband felt emboldened to echo that cruelty, his disdain sharpened by her approval. She fueled his arrogance, feeding his ego with praise while stoking his hatred with scornful remarks about his wife's uselessness. Little by little, the mistress became the architect of the wife's misery, orchestrating moments designed to strip her of dignity. Her manipulative whispers didn't just poison the husband's heart, they planted the seeds of unthinkable acts that would soon test the limits of human cruelty. It happened on a night when the air itself seemed heavy with malice, the sky dim and oppressive as if nature knew a crime against humanity was about to unfold. The husband, his eyes darkened by arrogance and poisoned by the mistress's whispers, dragged his heavily pregnant wife into the courtyard. Her pleas echoed in the stillness, her hands clutching at her swollen belly as she begged him to remember their love, their vows, and the innocent life growing inside her. But her words fell like raindrops against stone. He was deaf to compassion, his heart hardened by cruelty and blinded by lust for another woman's approval. The mistress stood nearby, her lips curled into a smile that betrayed her twisted delight. It was she who had planted the seed of this act, daring him to prove his devotion by degrading the very woman who had sacrificed everything for him. "Tie her up," she urged with venom dripping from her voice. "Show her who has the real power here. Show the world she's nothing." And he obeyed. Roughly, he bound his wife to the trunk of a tree, the coarse rope cutting into her wrists and pressing painfully against her swollen abdomen. The bark scraped her skin, leaving marks that stung with every movement. Tears streamed down her face, not just from the physical pain but from the unbearable humiliation of being treated worse than an animal by the man she had loved so deeply. Each knot tightened around her body was another reminder that her trust had been betrayed in the most horrifying way. Her cries carried into the night, but the neighbors, who peeked from behind curtains and cracked doors, chose silence over courage. They whispered among themselves about the cruelty unfolding before their eyes, but none dared to intervene. Society's judgment loomed over her, people labeling her weak, cursed, or deserving of her fate, unwilling to confront the husband's brutality. Their silence became a weapon, wounding her as deeply as the ropes that bound her. The humiliation crushed her spirit, yet somewhere within her trembling body, a flicker of strength remained. As she leaned against the tree, every breath a struggle, she whispered to her unborn child. Promises of survival, prayers for mercy, and vows that no matter what happened to her, their lives would hold meaning. The husband laughed coldly, drunk on his mistress's approval, while she stood with her arms crossed, savoring the sight of the wife's degradation. It was a spectacle of cruelty orchestrated by envy and carried out by a heartless man. That night, the world turned its back on her suffering, leaving her tied and broken, but not destroyed. For though her body was bound, her spirit clung fiercely to hope, and destiny was already preparing a reckoning none of them could foresee. The night was long, cold, and merciless. The wife, bound to the rough trunk of the tree, could feel the ropes cutting deeper into her skin with every passing hour. Her tears had dried, leaving salty stains on her cheeks, but inside her heart, a storm raged. The thought of her unborn child stirred her resolve. She could not let her suffering end here, in humiliation, abandoned to the cruelty of her husband and his mistress. Every beat of her heart echoed the same truth. She had to survive, not for herself alone, but for the tiny life growing inside her. With trembling hands and aching wrists, she began to twist her body against the ropes. Pain shot through her arms and belly, but she gritted her teeth, whispering to her child for strength. "We will not die here. We will not be broken," she muttered through labored breaths. The bark scraped her skin raw, and her body cried out for rest, yet she fought on. It was more than just a struggle against rope. It was a struggle against years of cruelty, of silence, of being treated as less than human. Each tug was an act of defiance, a declaration that she would no longer be a prisoner of her husband's wickedness. Hours seemed to blur, but finally, the rope loosened under her relentless effort. With one last surge of will, she freed her hands, the friction burning her skin but igniting her spirit. She stumbled to the ground, her legs weak and heavy, yet an unexplainable strength carried her forward. She pressed her palms against her stomach, whispering, "We're free, my child. We're free." That moment was more than a physical escape, it was symbolic. As she broke free from the bonds, she severed herself emotionally from the chains of her toxic marriage. The tree that had once been her prison now stood behind her, and every step she took away from it marked the beginning of her transformation from victim to survivor. The darkness of the night no longer terrified her. Instead, it became a cloak of protection, hiding her from the eyes that had mocked her. Exhausted but determined, she pushed forward into the unknown, her spirit fueled by resilience. She no longer carried the weight of despair, only the fierce determination of a mother who had chosen survival. Though broken and bruised, she had tasted freedom, and nothing, not even her husband's cruelty, could ever bind her again. The night had grown quieter, the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of crickets the only sound breaking the silence. The wife, staggering forward with trembling legs, thought she might collapse at any moment. Her body was bruised, her clothes torn, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her frame. Yet fate had other plans for her. A sleek black car, unfamiliar in her poor neighborhood, slowed as its headlights caught sight of her fragile figure emerging from the shadows. The driver rolled down the window, and out stepped a tall man in an immaculate suit, his presence radiating power and authority. He was a CEO, a man of wealth and influence, used to boardrooms and skyscrapers, not deserted roads in the middle of the night. But when his eyes landed on her, everything around him seemed to still. Shock crossed his face as he took in her disheveled state, the bruises on her arms, and the way she clutched her swollen belly protectively. "My God, what happened to you?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and concern. She tried to answer, but her lips quivered, and all that escaped was a faint whisper, her voice choked with both pain and fear. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, steadying her before she fell. His hands were gentle, careful not to hurt her further. He could feel how cold she was, how fragile, and yet, within her eyes, he saw something that stirred him deeply, an unbroken spirit, a quiet strength refusing to give in to despair. In that moment, the world of wealth and power he belonged to seemed meaningless compared to the urgency of saving her. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the night air. "You're safe now," he assured her, though he was a stranger. His voice carried a promise she had not heard in years, a promise of protection, of care, of dignity. She looked at him, uncertain, her heart torn between fear of trusting again and the instinct that told her this man was different. As he guided her into his car, the first thread of connection was woven between them. It was not born from luxury or desire, but from compassion in her darkest hour. For the CEO, helping her wasn't a choice, it was an instinct, one that would change both their lives forever. And for her, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter, where kindness replaced cruelty and hope began to flicker once more. The days that followed were unlike anything the wife had ever known. Instead of waking up to scorn and cruelty, she found herself surrounded by warmth and care. The CEO had arranged for the best doctors to tend to her injuries, ensuring her fragile body healed properly. At first, she was hesitant to accept the help, her mind still haunted by memories of the husband who had tied her to a tree and left her to suffer. But little by little, she began to realize this was not another trap. This was genuine kindness, something she had been starved of for so long. He never treated her like a burden. Each morning, he would check on her with a quiet gentleness that surprised her, asking how she felt, making sure she had everything she needed. The small gestures, a glass of water offered at the right time, a blanket adjusted on her shoulders, touched her heart more than grand promises ever could. Her body regained strength, but more importantly, her spirit, which had been nearly crushed, began to rise again. She started to believe that perhaps she was worthy of love and respect after all. Slowly, the walls she had built around herself began to soften. One evening, as they sat together in the garden of his estate, she shared a story about her unborn child, how she would sing to the baby in her womb to remind herself that life was still worth holding on to. Her voice trembled, but he listened intently, as if every word she spoke mattered. That simple act of being heard brought tears to her eyes, because for the first time, someone valued her thoughts, her dreams, her pain. In his presence, she began to smile again, shy at first, then more openly. The CEO noticed how her laughter lit up the room, and though he said nothing, his heart stirred in ways he hadn't expected. He admired her courage, her resilience, the way she carried her scars with quiet dignity. To him, she was not just a woman in need of help, she was extraordinary, a testament to strength in the face of cruelty. Their bond grew naturally, not rushed, not forced. A subtle romance bloomed in the space between compassion and trust. She, who had once felt unworthy, now realized she held immense value, not because of wealth or status, but because of who she was. And in this healing journey, she discovered that love, when rooted in kindness and respect, was the most powerful force of all. The husband, once so confident in his cruelty, began to taste the bitter fruit of his choices. At first, he still carried himself with arrogance, convinced that abandoning his pregnant wife for his mistress was the key to happiness and freedom. He flaunted his affair publicly, intoxicated by the attention and the illusion of control. But behind the glamorous mask, cracks quickly began to show. The mistress, who had promised him love and devotion, revealed her true nature. She was not there to love him. She was there to take from him, to squeeze out every last coin, every ounce of power, until nothing remained. His finances, once steady, began to spiral. The mistress had expensive tastes and endless demands. Designer clothes, luxury vacations, parties that stretched late into the night, each cost more than he could truly afford. Yet, blinded by his pride and his need to keep her satisfied, he gave in. Slowly but surely, his savings dwindled, debts piled up, and whispers began spreading through the community about his reckless spending. Where he once mocked his wife for being a burden, he now carried the weight of a mistress who treated him like a wallet rather than a man. Emotionally, too, he found himself drained. The mistress, no longer sweet and persuasive, turned sharp and critical. She mocked him when his money ran low, compared him to wealthier men, and belittled his attempts to please her. The man who had once held power over his wife was now trapped in a toxic cycle of manipulation, tasting the same humiliation he had so mercilessly inflicted. Neighbors and old friends, who once remained silent in the face of his cruelty, began to distance themselves. His reputation soured. The community, slowly uncovering the truth of what he had done to his wife, turned cold. Invitations stopped coming, respect dissolved, and he found himself isolated. Alone, broke, and chained to a woman who cared for nothing but her own gain, he began to realize that karma had arrived at his doorstep. The arrogance that once made him laugh at his wife's suffering was gone, replaced by bitterness and regret. Each day, he sank deeper into the quicksand of his own making, unable to escape the consequences of the choices that had destroyed not just his marriage, but his life. The mistress's betrayal came as swiftly as it was cruel. For so long, she had clung to the husband, whispering poison into his ears, making him believe that she was the only one who truly understood him. But the truth became undeniable once his wealth began to fade and his influence slipped from his grasp. The expensive gifts stopped coming, the parties dwindled, and the glamour she had bathed in vanished. Without money to feed her desires, she grew restless, snapping at him, mocking his failures, and finally, distancing herself altogether. One morning, he awoke to find her gone. No note, no goodbye, only emptiness where her perfume once lingered. Rumors soon spread that she had moved on to a wealthier man, flaunting herself at high society gatherings with a new companion on her arm. The same lips that once flattered him now laughed at his downfall behind closed doors. Her betrayal was not just abandonment, it was a final blow to his pride, proof that she had never loved him, only what he could provide. Public humiliation soon followed. The community, already aware of his cruelty toward his wife, now had fresh gossip to feed on. He became the subject of whispers and ridicule, a man who had tied his pregnant wife to a tree for a mistress who discarded him like trash. Former allies refused to associate with him, doors that were once open slammed shut, and even his business contacts severed ties. Social rejection pressed down on him like a crushing weight, stripping away every last shred of dignity. Alone and disgraced, he finally realized the bitter truth. His wife had loved him despite his flaws, while his mistress had only loved his money. By the time he understood, it was far too late. The CEO had stood by the wife through her darkest hours, offering not just his wealth but his unwavering support, compassion, and respect. He had seen her at her most broken, when her body bore the marks of cruelty and her spirit was weighed down by betrayal, yet he admired her strength, her quiet dignity, and the way she still carried hope for her unborn child. Over time, what began as compassion blossomed into love, a love rooted in trust, kindness, and the promise of a better future. One evening, in a moment as tender as it was profound, the CEO prepared a proposal that reflected not grandeur but meaning. Surrounded by soft lights and the warmth of close friends, he knelt before her, not as a billionaire flaunting riches but as a man offering his heart. With emotion in his voice, he promised her security, respect, and a love that would never diminish her worth. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe, valued, and cherished. Tears filled her eyes as she accepted, her voice trembling yet strong, knowing she was stepping into a new life where she would no longer be defined by suffering but by love and respect. Their marriage was not just a union of two people but a celebration of resilience and second chances. Guests marveled at her transformation from the woman once tied to a tree to a radiant bride, walking confidently into a future she deserved. The CEO's love gave her a foundation to rebuild, while her courage inspired him to cherish every moment. Together, they symbolized hope, that even the most broken beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. The wife, once silenced by cruelty, now stood as a wife, a mother, and a partner in a life filled with dignity, respect, and joy. The husband's final chapter was one of bitter regret. Once, he had believed himself untouchable, mocking the very woman who gave him loyalty and devotion. Now, stripped of wealth, abandoned by his mistress, and shunned by society, he wandered as a hollow man, tormented by memories of the cruelty he could never undo. In a cruel twist of fate, he often crossed paths with whispers of the woman he once tied to a tree, the woman he thought would never rise again. Instead of brokenness, he saw her thriving, glowing with strength and dignity as the wife of a respected CEO. From afar, he watched her step into places he could no longer enter, her presence commanding admiration. She was no longer the silenced, humiliated wife he left behind, but a woman of influence, cherished by her husband and adored by her child. Her laughter, once drowned in tears, now rang freely in gatherings where she was honored as both a survivor and a symbol of resilience. Every smile she wore was a reminder of what he had destroyed and what he could never regain. The contrast was unbearable. While he lived in shadows, battling disgrace and poverty, she basked in light, surrounded by love, respect, and new beginnings. The mistress who had once fueled his arrogance was gone, while his wife, his victim, had become untouchable in her triumph. It was the ultimate justice, a karmic balance that reminded everyone that cruelty, no matter how powerful in the moment, always destroys itself. The story closed not on his bitterness, but on her triumph. She had been beaten, humiliated, and discarded, yet she rose higher than ever, proving that strength grows in the soil of suffering. Her life became a testament to resilience, her journey a reminder that justice, though slow, never fails. In the end, his regret became his prison, while her triumph became her legacy.